I have the great personal pleasure of introducing Gary Gibbons. I'm going to leave the tough work to Rob Caleb, who's going to ask him the tough questions after his talk. Now, I've known Gary for 35 years. I mean, literally when he was a baby. And I would say to you that Gary is truly a Renaissance man. He's one person who's a true physician, but also has done some very fundamental, basic and translational research that's been very important in the area of vascular biology and hypertension, to expanding into clinical trials, and his years as the head of Cardiovascular Research Institute at Morehouse, he has certainly been very involved with minority health. So if you think about his portfolio, he's the man, I think the perfect person to be the NHLBI director. Somebody who has this breadth of understanding of what we need to do in this current day and age when we face such large disease burden. And it's really the ability to look at both the community health and the application of epidemiology, the new clinical opportunities of informatics, to clinical trial, to all the way looking at what are the more important molecular opportunities that can make a difference. So I was delighted, in fact, when Francis called and say, what about Gary Gibbons? I think he would be the perfect person. Now, I've known Gary when he was a medical student, when he came to work in my lab as a first-year student with both our mentor, Cliff Barger. And Cliff Barger would describe Gary as one of the brightest young men he's ever met. I remember that. And certainly it's my great pleasure to be his friend and his colleague for the last 35 years, having moved both Boston, West Coast back before I went to Atlanta. So Gary, I heard that your day last night, that dinner discussion of community health, and today you're meeting with the faculty from both young faculty, our minority faculty, as well as Division Chiefs have been spectacular. I know how busy you are. We thank you for coming to inspire us, but also perhaps to tell us about what the future is. And I think your title, Charting Our Future Together, is perfect because we're ready to work with you to move this whole health agenda forward. So thank you so much for spending your time. Come on up. Yeah, okay. Let's give him a round of applause.
Well, thank you very much, Victor, for that warm introduction. And as a federal employee, I can't give you any gifts, but I appreciate the fact that you didn't disclose any of those old stories about me. So I'll compensate for you later for that. It's a real pleasure to be here at Duke, and I've had a great period of time interacting with students and fellows and faculty. This is obviously a great institution, and it's a great privilege to be part of this listening tour in my first year or so as the new NHLBI director, to have this opportunity to engage the community in what I hope is a continuing dialogue as we indeed work as partners within a community to chart our future together. And Victor alluded to the fact that this was something that, a position that sort of came to me in some ways, and the more I thought about it, the more it resonated with who I am, where I've come from, and indeed a lot of what I believe is my life purpose as I see an alignment between the mission of the NHLBI and my own personal mission and purpose as someone who's a clinician scientist who is very interested in helping others and patients, as an educator interested in training and teaching and mentoring the next generation, and as a scientist interested in discoveries in the most fundamental ways and in ways that can also translate into enhances in human health. Moreover, from my upbringing, I've always been trained to give back and to not only be engaged in individual success, but for that success to have significance. in its impact on others. It's something my grandparents and parents instilled in me as an important value, and this position of public service, this privilege of public service helps me to live out that life purpose. And so what I'd like to just briefly outline, I'll try to be brief, is a series of thoughts we have about this stewardship role and public service role in which I want to engage you as leaders at a leading institution, really as partners in driving the biomedical enterprise and workforce. And I'm always humbled in taking on this position as an HOBI director and reminded that this isn't about Gary Gibbons and that I am an accountable steward and public servant. And in many ways, I really work for you. And so part of this visit is really to talk to my boss. You're my boss, the public's my boss, the patients are my boss, and certainly we've had 100 congressmen come to visit the NIH campus, and they remind me that they are also my boss. And part of our charge that keeps me focused is this Native American proverb, we do not inherit the land from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. And I think that that proverb resonated with me because I took on a leadership position that has a tremendous legacy of excellence and has spanned 65 years. And we stand at a juncture in a very different fiscal political environment in which we now have to pivot and start to look forward over the next 10 years. And part of this journey is really to imagine the NHLBI at age 75, 10 years from now, and start to envision what it would look like. And that's why this dialogue is important, to help engage you in helping to shape that vision. And this is what it's all about. It's about the future and the next generation. Obviously, you're aware that the fundamental discovery science that you're doing today is not going to pay off in a grant cycle necessarily in terms of human health. We recognize that. But the life cycle often is about a generation, 20 to 25 years before somebody like Rob Califf can ask and answer an important clinical science question in a randomized controlled trial that had its beginnings in basic science discovery some 20 years before. And in that sense, that's a time of a generation. Moreover, our second stewardship is really the young scientists. And it's that next generation that I feel is one of the most precious resources that we have to preserve and nurture, and I feel tremendous responsibility for, because as we try to navigate through the current fiscal and political environment, it's most critical that we not lose a generation as because of this contemporary situation. So it's with that view that there are two public goods, the enterprise and the workforce, that are in our stewardship domain that we're responsible for holding on for the next generation. And as we map this future, and one of the things I think is important is that we remember the recipe of success, if you will, the compass due north of certain enduring principles that I think are important in good times and bad. They're listed here to value investigator-initiated fundamental discovery science as really the bedrock of what NIH and NIH investments, and certainly NHLBI's investments, should prioritize as a critical element of what I think the Institute does best and where it plays the most catalytic, if not transformative role. The second principle is to maintain a balance that crosses disciplines in our portfolio and takes on the whole spectrum of basic translational, clinical, and population science. As Victor alluded to, I've had the privilege of being engaged in each of those domains of research through various activities and collaboration and working in team science. And it's given me an appreciation for the complementary nature of each of those domains and how really they're interdependent in terms of asking and answering important scientific questions, particularly those questions that have levels of complexity and have public health significance. And so increasingly, I think it's important, again, maybe even more important in these fiscal environment, that we maintain that balance. Thirdly, I think we have an important obligation to ensure that we're fulfilling our mission, which is to turn discovery science into the enhancements of the health of the nation. And in order to do that, it's important for us to fulfill that mission by supporting implementation science that empowers patients and partners, and indeed systems, that improve the health of the nation and health outcomes. That needs to be a part of what we do. And again, the visit of 100 congressmen to the campus over the last year, which I understand is unprecedented, is because we do need to make the value proposition for our investment in you. And a critical part of that value proposition that we make to the public and the people's representatives who appropriate our budget is articulating that linkage between how our investments in your investigator-initiated research enhances the lives of their constituents that vote for them. And I think one of the compelling elements of that is being able to demonstrate how an important effect those investments are having on clinical practice, patient outcomes, and indeed the public's expenditures of our healthcare dollars. The fourth principle is really to train a diverse new generation of leaders in science. And it's probably self-evident that I'm particularly passionate about ensuring that we have a diverse biomedical workforce, one indeed that is pursuing excellence and taps into the excellence that is part of all communities in this nation, indeed what makes America great and preeminent. And finally, to value the health of all communities, to recognize that we not only just want to increase the average health of the nation, but we want to ensure that all communities participate in the advances and investments that we make in advancing the biomedical enterprise and influence health. Now, in order to do that, we don't do that from Bethesda with the employees that we have. We need to do that in partnership with you and others, partners with patients, investigators, our policymakers, our colleagues in federal agencies, patient advocacy groups. All of this circle of partners, all these players are critical for us to really fulfill our mission. In essence, we can't do it from Bethesda. And again, that's part of why I'm engaging in this so-called listening tour, visiting some of the major academic health centers, because we need to ensure that we have a shared vision of how we can move forward. And it is our view that we'd like to envision ourselves as a diverse, collaborative network of scientific leaders. And this is an opportunity, as I've had over the last 2 days, to engage you in a conversation about pathways forward. And so it's particularly critical that when we look at the biomedical workforce, we do something of a reality check. And one of the things that I found very sobering in taking on this position over the last year was recognizing the demographic profile of the NIH-funded awardees. And my vision is failing. It's hard for me to see this red sliver of African Americans who are constituted as PI grantees, as well as this sliver of Hispanic grantees. On the right is the demographic profile of the American population. And when we ask what should the NHLBI look like in 10 years when it's 75, I'm hoping that and envisioning and hope to work with you to see that we're on a pathway where we're tapping in to the talent of a demographically changing population in which indeed a lot of these small slivers will be the majority in the coming generation. And I think it's critical for the future of the biomedical enterprise that we tap into all these communities such that our grantee population starts to look like America and in its diversity. And I believe that that diversity is not something that we do for moral reasons or political correctness. I deeply believe, and there's actually research data to confirm, that when you want innovation, creativity, movement of technologies, and believe applications to all communities, that we need to leverage the differences and diversity incumbent within that biomedical community to achieve excellence. The diversity is part of how we fulfill our commitment to excellence. Now, I've kind of learned a couple of things along the way about what may be useful to enhancing the success of scientists from underrepresented groups, and they're kind of capsulized here. The key part for me starts with the individual and what I have labeled here passion. You know, you can imagine I got introduced to science by working under Victor Zhao. So those of you who interact with Victor, if you don't have passion, then you'll wilt quickly. But clearly, passion is also infectious. And Victor also taught me a lot about his drive and determination for both excellence and being at the leading edge of science and enjoying it. He and Dr. Barger. And I believe that that passion is what drives science and success in science, and it's critical. In addition, this may seem odd, but I actually think faith is an important element in nurturing particularly underrepresented minority scientists. And it may seem odd, but I actually believe that it is an article of faith for many minority scientists. I think it's an article of faith when you embark on an unknown pathway where you're actually not sure of where it's going or how it's going to end or even how you're going to get there. And there's no one in your immediate circumstance who's ever gone that pathway before. And indeed, there are people in your context who have barriers and put up roadblocks and have themselves a lot of unbelief about your potential to succeed. And to set out into that unknown without any sense of the potential for success, in many ways is an article of faith. And it takes a lot of self-belief, particularly if there's no precedent in your immediate surround. And so I believe that if an underrepresented minority scientist has the passion and that faith, that it's our responsibility as leaders to match that, meet them halfway with opportunity, and to indeed be part of creating a village in which we mentor and promote their success and development. And now that I'm in this role at NIH, that we make sure that they're empowered with the resources to excel and succeed and achieve their vision and dreams. Just to give a little bit of commercial shout out to a new initiative that's coming out of the Common Fund that's in the space of trying to promote diversity in underrepresented groups. The RFAs and FOAs, some of which are already out, some of which are on the way, are designed to enhance this diversity. This is a program called BUILD, which is actually targeted at one of the key leak points in the pipeline for promoting underrepresented groups' representation in the biomedical workforce. The transition that occurs from underrepresented students who come into college interested in science, but that interest wanes and then falls off precipitously when it comes to the transition from bachelor's degree to pursuing a graduate PhD degree. And this is targeted at developing innovative strategies to promote greater success and retention in science during that critical transition period, includes loan repayment, stipends, research experiences, etc. And that's something that's moving forward. We're hopeful that great institutions like this one can participate by partnering with undergraduate institutions where there's a large concentration of underrepresented groups within the undergraduate bodies. And North Carolina has had a great historic tradition of having some of those undergraduate institutions that might benefit from interactions with a place like Duke. Similarly, there's a plan to develop a national mentorship research network to serve as a mentor research resource in which, again, accomplished scientists can reach out and link to some of these students who may, again, be in undergraduate environments or indeed junior faculty positions or postdoctoral fellowship positions where they don't have the kind of local mentorship they need. And again, these are some of the initiatives underway. So part of our goal here is to sustain and promote and create this diverse networked community and biomedical workforce. But clearly we have some challenges in the current landscape shifts, both fiscal, political, scientific, and otherwise, that challenge us. I won't dwell on this, but you all have experienced the consequences of some of this turbulence that we've had to navigate through. Nothing like taking a job and then finding out 2/3 of the way through your fiscal year that you have to find $175 million. And sort of welcome to NIH, Gary. But part of what was helpful in navigating that through is when we tried to stay true to a certain set of principles. One was, again, to maintain balance and to the extent possible, try to ensure that no particular segment of our stakeholders or our budget or our program portfolio took an inordinate hit and that there was a broad share sacrifice. In addition, consistent with that first enduring principle, we prioritized investigator-initiated R01s as one of the higher priorities. And this enabled us to actually manage, despite the cut, to actually increase the number of R01s in fiscal year 13 as compared to 12, and to increase the pay line to 11% compared to the previous year 10%. This involves some streamlining of what were institute-initiated RFAs to help make that happen. But again, it was in keeping with that principle. The other principle was to, quote-unquote, protect the young, particularly early-stage investigators, and maintaining that buffer pay line to be sure that that stayed at above 20%, and to sustain the K and T32s as much as we could and protect them. One other initiative that is just rolling out, that I guess I'm giving you a slight preview about, is to preserve productive programs. And one of the new initiatives we've started is recognizing in these tough, challenging times, their investigators have been very productive for many years, and whom our previous investments are at risk because they've come in and just missed the pay line after a couple of applications. And the choice may be to actually shut down their laboratory and lose a lot of the investment that we've had. And in the nature of this enterprise, very tough to shut down and then restart. And so we're instituting an R56 mechanism within NHLBI. It's been used by other institutes as a bridge award to help sustain those R01s that are coming in for renewal and weren't funded in their A1 last shot, but came close, indicative that it's in fact, in general, an outstanding application in which the likelihood is very high that if they have time to reboot and rewrite, that they will be successful, and we want to preserve that in between period. So that's a new mechanism that we're rolling out in the spirit of keeping as many boats alive and afloat of investigator-initiated programs out there. I can't dwell on the details, but it should be on the website as a new initiative. And so this is part of our first year in which we've systematically gone through a sort of diagnostic phase and an opportunity to really relook at how we're managing our investment portfolio. and where it's clear that we have an opportunity to take this crisis and do some internal transformation, become a smarter learning organization, as I've been calling it, where we're investing in scientific innovation in a more efficient, effective, and strategic sort of way than perhaps the previous appropriation models that tended to be inexorable climbs tended to promote. And when flat is the new normal, we clearly have to be strategic. So now we're much more involved in an iterative process of strategic priority setting, allocation, and evaluation of our portfolio, almost analogous to what you do in your retirement fund on a periodic basis. And we have to do that more systematically related to our investments. So that's a process in which we hope to engage you as we set those strategic priorities. Now let me pivot from some of the operational things to what I hope are some of the opportunities that we can pursue in our scientific agenda. And the one is to celebrate our success, in which really the NHLBI is a poster child at NIH in its demonstration that the investments it has made over the last couple of decades have turned research into results that have bent curves in cardiovascular outcomes, reducing coronary heart deaths by over 60% over the last couple of decades. And that's been a tremendous record that relates to fundamental discovery science like those of Brown and Goldstein, landmark clinical trials that have shown efficacy in treating hypertension, coronary disease, heart failure, that have transformed practice and resulted in these outcomes. One of our challenges, though, is that those remarkable successes haven't been as evenly distributed as they could be. There's still pockets of inequities as we look out across the country. There are counties that don't participate fully in a lot of the advances and investments that we've made. Indeed, I suspect there's some counties here in North Carolina, perhaps even pockets of Raleigh-Durham, in which we still have some unfinished business in making public health impact. And certainly our portfolio has the major causes of death and disability in this country, both in heart disease, lung disease, and blood disorders. Indeed, these are also not only chronic causes of death and disability, but of major healthcare expenditures. And so we have a particular challenge and opportunity to make a difference if we can bend these curves. And these are some of the curves that I think we'd like to share with you as part of our mutual challenge and opportunity. And we look forward to working with you to change the natural history here. There's too much in the way of emergency room visits, as shown here, for African American and Latino asthmatics, both children and adults. And that these are health disparities that I believe we can address. Similarly, this middle panel shows the incidence of end-stage kidney disease in African Americans, Native Americans, and all Americans here. But you see the outliers, particularly in African Americans, often driven by hypertension predominantly, but also diabetes. And the last panel reflecting sickle cell disease, and one of the success stories of the NHLBI in doing clinical trials to show the efficacy of transfusion therapies, but indeed still gaps to be filled in. In that regard, I think in many ways health inequities is almost like a prism that I believe can be very informative about how we, as a stretch goal, can develop a more effective healthcare system that benefits all Americans. If we can crack this nut, if we can make a difference here, I believe that in many ways we will have a better healthcare delivery system for all Americans. And at the least, I think we will have revealed strategies and pathways that will make us more efficient and effective at what we do in achieving public health impact. And I'm excited about this opportunity because I see a convergence of approaches, both in system science, at the basic biomedical sort of model of systems biology and systems medicine, but also in a larger social context of the socio-ecological framework, which looks at things at a multi-level systems sort of approach. And it's sort of this convergence in which we're starting to stretch beyond the classic reductionist model of a single laboratory, a single individual, unidimensional data sets, asking a tightly focused question to one in which we not only do that classical reductionist strategy, but in a yin-yang kind of way, we have a complementary strategy that takes a more system approach to addressing these complex problems, that looks at the whole, that appreciates the multidimensional, multi-level nature of complex data and systems, and looks at pathways rather than single molecules. I believe this is part of the future and the opportunity in the 21st century. The systems approach also aligns very well with trying to make a public health impact for complex problems that are probably not solved by one single stakeholder or one node of intervention, but may indeed involve systems change to be effective, in which we appreciate the individual not only as someone who's in a one-on-one visit with a clinician, but also exists within a broader context of family and culture and community and environment and things beyond the clinic wall that are having an impact on their health, again, in a multi-level fashion. We've had some exposure to this when I was in Atlanta, and we were involved in a population-based cohort that we developed called MetaHealth that was a biracial cross-sectional study in Atlanta, and we were testing this socio-ecological model that where you live, work, and play matters. And we asked this question as we did analyses that showed that African Americans were obese and also less likely to engage in physical activity and eat fruits and vegetables. And then when we start to probe further as to why they were more physically inactive, they replied to this question: my neighborhood offers opportunities to be physically active. And you can see the African Americans were much more likely to disagree with that statement, sort of regardless of their income strata. Again, consistent with the model that the environment that had been shaped by the history of Atlanta in terms of racism, segregation, the neighborhoods where African Americans were concentrated tend to result in an environmental context that wasn't conducive to a healthy lifestyle, and indeed predispose them to this high-risk profile. And this is sort of a framework that we're a bit enamored of looking at these health inequities as part of an ecosystem and appreciating the multi-level nature of things in which a lot of these social determinants are driving what we're calling an exposome, an environmental set of exposures that are influencing the risk to the health inequities that we know: stroke, renal failure, heart failure. And more intriguingly, we think there's an opportunity for this convergence of these various disciplines to come together and start to understand what we're calling the biosocial interface, in which we're starting to appreciate how these exposomes might affect biological systems like the immune system and physiologic systems, the epigenome, the microbiome, and that's all superimposed on genomic variation that has implications in terms of race, ethnicity. And so it's in this sort of systems approach that we start to have the opportunity. I think that it's unprecedented to delve in, to have a deeper understanding of health inequities, and in many ways is a prism for a more integrated way to look at both biology and public health. This was sort of illustrated in some ways by, again, an observation we had in Atlanta, where Morehouse School of Medicine was located on the rim of this neighborhood sector that was predominantly African American, pretty segregated, in one of the poorest parts of the city, and in which we characterized as a food desert. And again, partially related to the low fruit and vegetable intake of African Americans in that population. And we're all aware that a diet rich in fruits and vegetables is probably related to a reduction in cardiovascular events, reducing hypertension, We enjoyed a lot of the good red wine last night and appreciated that a lot of the color of fruits and vegetables includes phytochemicals that gives it that vibrant color. In the work of Wang and Stan Hazen and others, we're starting to appreciate that our diet includes chemicals that affects the balance of microbes in our gut, the microbiome. And Wang and all showed very intriguingly that the anthocyanins in fruits and vegetables and red wine are broken down by certain microbes. And those metabolites in turn affect immune cell expression of certain microRNAs that then indeed modulate monocyte macrophage behavior in atherosclerosis. And I thought that was a provocative observation in which we're starting to have the rudiments to connect that socio-ecological framework to biological pathways and systems that may have new insights into the mediators and mechanisms of health inequities. And as we continue to advance the scientific paradigm, I'm hopeful that we'll gain new insights into how to deal with this very vexing problem. And so it's this convergence of opportunities that I think are empowered by the scientific opportunities that are really just coming to the fore, that we can appreciate how this systems approach can enable us to fulfill our mission of linking discovery science and public health impact. And a critical element of that is through strategic partnerships in which we can leverage applied research and implementation science with health systems. And that's one of the things that I'm excited about in our visit, particularly today at Duke, where I think we have some unprecedented opportunities to leverage both our basic science observations and advances in genomics with our appreciation for how systems work and how together they can have an impact on human health. We have an opportunity to appreciate that the health of this community, as in the health of the nation, really reflects how the system works or doesn't work, and that the levers for making that system work don't reside solely with NIH or CMS or AHRQ or the academic health center, but involves really us working more as a network community to address things like health inequities. And that part of our charge is to be sure that research discoveries are translated and implemented by reaching through our partners and practice systems to actually change health outcomes in ways that reduce health inequities, both in this country and around the world. And I believe as we increasingly start to think of the various components of those systems, we have the opportunity to make a difference in ways that we haven't before. And in this regard, I think it's important for our institute to have the full breadth of a research agenda and portfolio that spans the full spectrum, always maintaining our core in basic research and discovery science and fundamental discovery in particular as our bedrock. But that there are opportunities to ensure that those do move to bedside and patients and practices, and indeed at the end of the day affect patients in the real world context. And it's this part of the platform where I think we have some gaps, and where I think this is particularly an opportune moment with the changes that are happening in the medical care system and healthcare reform, where NIH can play a catalytic role, certainly not a solo role, but in partnership with other federal agencies and academic centers to make an impact in fulfilling our mission to enhance the health of the nation. In that regard, it clearly will be leveraging other things we're doing in discovery science in population-based cohorts. And so I believe that if we're going to make a difference in health inequities, we must have that fundamental population science base. And NHLBI has a proud legacy of ensuring the diversity and inclusiveness of that. I'd like to see that more robustly expressed in our health systems clinical cohorts to ensure that we're inclusive of all populations, including those in safety net hospitals and clinics as part of these clinical cohorts. And I think this would complement our classic population-based cohorts in Framingham, Jackson, Mesa, the Hispanic Community Health Study, and the Strong Heart Study that, again, reflect the diversity of America, and applying all the technologies that we now have to bear in elucidating disease, particularly the causes of health inequities. And in that regard, we're excited by the opportunities that exist now in 2013 that are unprecedented. And Victor mentioned how long he's known me, and I know that 35 years sounds like a long time for a guy who looks this good. But I am old enough to have had one of these cameras. How many had an Instamatic? You know, that's, okay. These guys are not too ashamed to admit it. But that was leading edge stuff. Instamatic and Kodak was dominant at that time in photography. You know, 95% of the business. But one of the challenges of that dominance is that they probably got a little complacent and, needless to say, didn't see this coming, in which, if you really want to talk about Instamatic, this is Instamatic. I'm hoping that we're not doing that in biomedicine, that we're not missing and seizing the opportunities that lie before us in an information, knowledge generation economy. I'm always intrigued by the other entities within our economy. Particularly, I show you here Amazon. This is actually my personal screenshot. It says, you know, "Hi Gary" up there. This was actually pulled out before Christmas. And clearly, Amazon has mastered big data. It knows every keystroke I make on the site. It knows what I looked at, browsed, bought, and it's working its informaticists to figure out and predict what Gary's going to do next. And I got to admit, you can see, I'm probably disclosing too much, you can see what it thinks of my book selection. This was before Christmas, and it suggested the biography by Jefferson, and it clearly knew I'm a sucker for biographies. I like biographies. And I have to admit, that was my gift for myself for Christmas. So Amazon knows me better than I know me. And it makes you sort of step back and sort of say, you know, why isn't it that you guys, when you're on the wards, don't have that same predictive capability? We should, in the world's preeminent scientific community and one of the world's preeminent health systems, have that same capability. And I have a sense that Rob has a little inkling about creating a data warehouse along those lines, but I think we share that view that the time is now to leverage some of this digital data. And I always get afraid we're a little slow on the uptake. I look at things that Google's doing with health maps and sort of tracking flu epidemics by tracking, again, big data and mining it, seeing how the cough medicine sales are going, to trace epidemics. You know, those of us who struggle to have enough postdocs in our group, you know, I look at the ornithologists at Cornell. They had this study, and it's really a brilliant way to do science. So they take advantage of birders all over the country. They have a training module to train the birders to collect data for them, and it's free labor. It's like they have 1,000 postdocs out there looking at nesting behavior of birds. And so now they're able to take all this data from all over the country and create large data sets from it. And again, at pretty low cost, because they're leveraging this birder capability. Even the patients, I think, are outpacing the academic health centers. They're going to create their own CROs with, you know, patients like me, in which they're going to develop and design trials and develop registries that are going to make, you know, rival Rob's data warehouse, I suspect, very soon. I look at entities like Zeo, in which they're going to, take this kind of technology and make capabilities to understand sleep-wake cycles. I understand that although their business model still needs some work, they have probably 40,000 folks with their sleep-wake cycles all over the country. Imagine if you're a sleep researcher to have 40,000 sets of basically sleep studies that you can mine. There's stuff you can just sort of see on how, what happens when we switch to daylight saving time. And you can actually watch that and the effect on sleep-wake cycles in 40,000 people. And you didn't have to invite any of them for a sleep study. Tremendous opportunities that exist that we need to be able to tap into. Clearly, this thing, as you know, can measure an EKG, blood pressure, metabolic activity. This is the future that I hope we're poised to embrace. And again, I think that the patients might be ahead of us. I look at the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, and they've got their registries going. They're working through partnerships with pharma, like Vertex. They're working on designs. They're committed. They're tapping into the passion to get enrollments and accruals. And again, I think they're outperforming academic centers. There's something that, again, a funding agency can learn from in this regard. So there's an element of citizen science that I think is a new part of the 21st century that we've had to learn how to embrace and channel. And indeed, I think this can help us in having a diverse portfolio. We'll always have our core, deeply phenotyped, classically ascertained, sort of thick data set of our cohorts like Framingham. But I'm excited by the opportunities to get these other forms of data collection, recognizing their limitations, in which we can still ask and answer certain questions at a scale that we couldn't imagine before. And so we're envisioning this new age of big data and knowledge exchange networks that are going to leverage all this digital information in really probably unimaginable ways. And I'm hoping that they can be harnessed for the purpose of fulfilling our mission of discovery science that enhances human health, particularly at the community level, and that it engages health systems, not only just Duke, but networks of health systems that can link in the whole spectrum, in which we not only have our HMOs, but we have our federally qualified health centers as well. That we have diversity in our cohorts like Jackson, but we also have diversity in our patient-powered networks. Not just the CF group, but maybe the sickle cell group as well. And that we leverage the clinical information systems as well as computational biologists in these networks. And that we extend beyond our clinic walls and start to think about community resource networks, community organizations that again can inform community health and be partners in bending these curves. And again, circling around patients as a key part. I think this diverse, cross-disciplinary set of investigators, and I use investigators broadly because I think as we move into the 21st century further, that citizen science will make citizens actually generators of data in the same way that you are generators of data. That indeed every encounter is a data gathering opportunity. In just the same way that I think an astute clinician is learning from every patient and every patient encounter, we ought to have a data and a system that is learning from each encounter. And that's a network that I believe is rich for research. And I believe that NIH needs to be sure we're capitalizing and leveraging those investments. Because I believe also that this is an unprecedented time in science. This is a great time, I believe, to be pursuing this career path because of what's happening in systems biology and medicine. I'm excited by what's going on in reparative biology and medicine, some of which we had tastes of in the last couple of days at UNC and Duke. I'm challenged but inspired by the opportunities that I think we have to make a difference in health inequities, both in this country and around the globe. I'm excited by what might appear to be audacious sort of goal, and to take what is our challenging portfolio of chronic diseases, the major causes of death and disability, the kind of diseases that one of which I have, for which I have to take pills every day. I'm jealous of the Cancer Institute, and it's not just because they have twice the budget that I have, but I'm jealous because they talk about remission. They even start to talk about cure. I'm tired of my hypertensive medicines and taking that statin every day. Why aren't we talking about remission? Why do we resign ourselves to just symptom relief? And I think that's an opportunity for the 21st century of our portfolio and our investigators. We should be able to understand the pathways that enable us to predict and preempt and change the natural history of chronic disease. That, to me, is part of what the opportunity is for the NHLBI in the next 10 years, at least to put us on that trajectory. And the tools that we have in hand are unprecedented in our omic technologies, imaging, informatics, engineering, stem cell biology, and indeed the nature of the collaboration across disciplines that this convergence of a systems approach will enable, I think provides us with the means to make that difference. Let me just give one illustration of where I think the opportunity might lie. Here's a compelling curve of health inequities in which a key driver of our Medicare expenditures is chronic kidney disease going through the roof. A key driver of that is a health inequities problem of African Americans in particular, is shown here. And what we're now being informed of is that this could also be an opportunity to understand pathways and interventions that may relate to what we're learning about genomic variation, and an appreciation that the genomic architecture of African American reflects our population history. My genome, like this representative one, is a mosaic of variants that we share across populations, but some that reflect African ancestry in particular. And that varies by chromosome and location. And that tells us that it's been shaped by history. Perhaps the most graphic example being that of the effect of malaria in sub-Saharan Africa, in which that exposome interacting with our genome created an ecosystem that shaped genomic variation in a way that probably is influencing our immune defense systems and our host genomic variation. And that's had clear implications, sickle cell disease being a classic example, but one in which the environmental influence has interacted at that biosocial interface. And I think this is a very provocative paper by Genovese et al. Involving a COP here at NIH and a number of others, Pollock, in which they showed the APOL1 gene variant is associated with a 5-fold increased risk of chronic kidney disease. This isn't a puny GWAS with a 1.2 odds ratio. It's a major penetrant effect. And moreover, it's a very common, a relatively common variant. The risk variance about 12% of the African American population. And high prevalence is actually indicative, probably of the fact that it was under positive selection. And it was under positive selection because it's now known that that protein, that variant, actually kills the parasite that causes sleeping sickness endemic in sub-Saharan Africa. And so it was selected for because of that exposome. It was probably a beneficial survival factor for those with the variant. So in a salt-poor environment, it was a great thing to have. Fast forward a few thousand years later, in America, where you have Bojangles and Kentucky Fried Chicken and high sodium diet and hypertension, having that ancestry and that variant is no longer a benefit. And clearly is driving the high prevalence of end-stage renal disease in African Americans. And so it begs this what-if question as we envision the future of the NHLBI, that we may have a variant here that is predictive of an outcome of patients with hypertension in a particular race ancestry group that might address a health inequity and a major issue in our healthcare system. And we may be able to use it for risk prediction, for pharmacogenomic strategies, and most intriguingly to me, starting to elucidate pathways that drive the development of chronic kidney disease. As it turns out, this is expressed in endothelial cells, smooth muscle cells, and the immune system. And it will be very intriguing to elucidate what's downstream as potentially novel targets to perhaps preempt the progression of kidney disease. And the same paradigm, I think, is throughout our whole portfolio. We've always been intrigued by this observation in the lung field, where exposure to tobacco smoke puts patients on this sort of inexorable decline in pulmonary function, even if they stop smoking. And I always ask my pulmonary colleagues that in cardiovascular, if you stop smoking, eventually the data suggests that the overall risk starts to return back toward those who never smoked. Not the case in lung disease. What causes that progression, and what can we do to arrest, change the natural history, or even produce regression? And finally, what I found particularly daunting, but I think a challenge that I think is soluble, is the problem of sickle cell disease, particularly among children, where we have this situation in which children in this country have strokes. This country has gone through some devastating things in Newtown and other situations where we've mourned the loss of a child's life. And I think the analogous sort of distress comes when you think about children who are having strokes at age 3, 4, 5, 6. This is the first molecular medicine identified disease, and yet I believe that they shouldn't have the cognitive disability and stroke that comes from understanding something that we've known the genetic basis is for 50 years. I think this is an opportunity for a research agenda to elucidate in a way that can change this natural history. And at my first American Society of Hematology meeting as a newbie director at the plenary session, something got a hold of me, and I put out a challenge that I think we as a collective should embrace the challenge of having a stroke-free generation of children with sickle cell disease, that this is something that the community can do, taking a multi-pronged approach. So what I've tried to do is to give you a sense of our vision of the opportunities that lay ahead of us, recognizing the challenges that currently exist, and the hope that we can do this in partnership, and indeed to invite you into the strategic visioning of setting that agenda together. Thank you very much for your attention.
I think we have about 10 minutes for Q&A, and I know we have some people in the audience who are not shy about asking questions.
Yourself included.
Yeah, I'm going to hold back, but Jesse.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm Jessie Tenenbaum with the Rockfield and Transition Medicine. My background is in informatics, and so the whole world is a big data source to me. I was wondering if you could comment on the thing about the birds is the birds weren't worried about their privacy. And so Facebook and Google and all that are a great source of wealth of knowledge, and you can crowdsource a lot of things, but particularly in light of the race disparity that you discussed and post-internet lacks. Can you talk about some of the sensitivities there? And I have very based on but I'm going to put it out there, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very important point that we clearly, part of our other stewardship is the public trust. And we have to be sure that the resources that we are creating balance that open accessibility as a public good with appreciation for privacy. And I think those are the things that we need to dialogue about in the same way that we've had discussions about genomics over time, and the presentation of that data and the openness about it. I think we definitely have to have that dialogue in an open and transparent way about the ethical and legal social implications of all this data sharing. Obviously, that being said, I think it is fair to say that they're consultants for the politicians and Amazon, and that probably know more about me than the NSA does. And so I think that's the part where we have to definitely balance, and I totally agree with that.
Other questions? Well, let me get even a little more provocative than that. And you may or may not want to comment on this, but I think specifically, but you might want to give some ideas about how you're going to deal with the impending issues. Just before I came over here, my old friend Eric Topol he's now the editor of Medscape, and in his monthly blog, he commented on something which I actually saw in person a month ago when I was in Beijing. And that was the intent of the Beijing Genome Institute to sequence very large numbers of Chinese people and then to use those sequencing for marital counseling based on polymorphisms. And they also showed data that by doing fetal ultrasound in the second trimester, they could almost eliminate congenital heart disease births. And it was really dramatic, obviously highly effective depending on your view of what terminating pregnancy means. So what I used to think was way off in the distance, and Eric just made the comment that this is not so far in the distance now, and we're going to have to come to grips about how to deal with it. Also mentioned, I just reviewed an article for European Heart Journal. In Switzerland, they actually did second trimester ultrasounds as a health policy, and what they showed was there were almost no births in high-risk congenital heart disease. I'm sensitive to that since I have a daughter who had that condition who's doing well now. So you're going to be in the middle of this in terms of policy. How are you going to think about this and approach it?
Yeah, well, as you say, I think this is a discussion and dialogue we have to have as part of being a democratic society, perhaps in contrast to others. I think we have to have that as an open debate and discussion. And we have some principles that have been brought to bear in addressing this. Certainly, one of the things that I think will be helpful is to, I think there's some opportunities, for example, in the example I gave, where I could argue that I would rather have a study with all African Americans in which I was selected because I have an APOL1 variant, rather than because there was some hypothesis related to the color of my skin that may actually have very little to do with my race, ethnicity per se. And so I think I say that to say that there's some utility of this that I think can actually be of benefit to certain groups, that it's not always about the vulnerability and exploitation from a Henrietta Lacks standpoint, but it actually can be empowering. And so that's also part of democratizing this. I agree with you that with that openness also comes a responsibility to educate and to allow individuals to make informed decisions. And so I think that's the part that we as a free and open democracy need to work on, is be sure that we respect that privacy, but also we're empowering people to make their own decisions with this information.
Victor, do you have any questions?
Well, I think, again, thank you, first of all, for sharing just a set of very inspirational messages. I'm a little overwhelmed by the opportunities, and yet we know what the situation is with regards to funding sequestration. I think where people are just too polite to ask you this question, which you've been asked probably privately, is not only about how you're going to be able to sustain maintain the trajectory, but how you're going to create a portfolio. Much of what you're talking about, which, as you know, I strongly believe with regards to the opportunity to look at community population health, the big data, in a single size plot, with the question about what are the basic research that many of us have carried out. And in fact, you and I have all lived a life of a continuum, being able to see all of this. But I think many people want to know, from your perspective, how you can maintain that portfolio.
Sure.
Particularly in this context of the shrinking or sluggishness.
Yeah. Well, as I emphasized, I think our number one enduring principle is, again, to value fundamental discovery science. So I still see that as a bedrock and as a starting point. But as I said also, I think a balanced portfolio is critically essential as part of our investment portfolio. And as we move forward, what it will challenge us to do is to really step back and look at our portfolio in a very sober and critical way. My sense is there may be some things that were well intended 15 years ago, 10 years ago. We'll have to step back and say, is it still compelling? Are there ways we can do it more efficiently and effectively? I know, Rob has made a compelling case that there are ways that we might be able to do some elements of clinical research in a much more efficient and effective way. I think the current crisis forces us to be resourceful and adaptive in that regard. It's still my sense that with even post-sequester, with nearly $3 billion, that we have strategic priorities, some of which we've outlined, that I think are compelling, we still have the resources to invest. The other component is that this fiscal situation, I think, also compels us to do more collaboratively and in partnership. And as you alluded to, when we start to think about, let's say, in a community health agenda, there may be something where, unlike a classic RCT, where we try to do everything from A to Z and fund every aspect, some of these other approaches are more leveraged and borrow, if you will, infrastructure, either from other systems or other partners. And in that way, collectively, we can cost share and create synergies that, even given what current resources we have, can stretch and reach and still have impact. So I think it forces us.
Let me push a little harder on this issue. First of all, we talked about actually today about partnership. And it's always amazed me, and I do know that they have to do with congressional mandate and everything else, that agencies don't cross-collaborate, particularly in areas of healthcare and health, and the health of the nation, right? I mean, you think about the opportunity of all these agencies coming together to address this. Also, in the core of this is that I didn't hear you talk about industry. In fact, the fundamental issue about enhancing health is the collaboration with industry, and I don't mean the usual hand-waving collaboration, but true collaboration to say, these are really big national priorities. Let's pitch our resources together. What are your visions about either?
No, I think it's a great point. When I talk about translation, I think one of the effective translation mechanisms in a free enterprise system is commercialization. And so that's one element. We've traditionally been an R&D component, particularly on the sort of proximal discovery end, and hoping that translates and actually prodding it through. And actually NIH has a fairly substantial portfolio to help promote that. Something we can continue to enhance, but one that I think is reasonably robust. The other part, and it sort of extends an earlier dialogue, is what is the R&D for the health systems? And I think that's also an opportunity that NIH, particularly in the sphere of implementation science, is in essence functioning in that sort of early proximal R&D role again, where we will fund investigators and systems to test models of how, in fact, to have patient outcome impact in a way that really is maybe an extension of our classic clinical trials. So I think there's, again, an opportunity for partnership there. And in this case, not only even private industry in the sense of classic pharma, but maybe also in the insurance industry and other players that benefit from some of those investments. And so I think there are certainly models there. Even some of the things I actually heard about today with some of your colleagues who are interested in these embedded simple trials. What if we create these platforms within systems? There could be, again, cost-sharing opportunities that benefit systems and players who like to ask and answer questions within that system. And as long as there's a research base, we can contribute to that, even though it's in essence leveraging resources that come from other players. So I agree with you. It probably will be some different models than in the past, but I think it's an opportunity.
I would urge you in your leadership to push for these new models. You know, I always wonder why CMS and NIH are not working together. After all, you know, there's one end talking about innovation, and innovation is all about saving money on the one hand, right? On the other hand, we want to look at new models of, you know, treatment of hypertension. I mean, they can converge very easily. And yet, you know, we have to go to different agencies to get different funding for different reasons.
Right. Well, Ram keeps banging the heads of the agencies together. I know you've been working on that for a long
It
time.
may surprise people to know that each agency,
Don't get wrong,
that's a good maneuver, but most people don't realize that the agencies themselves have internal lawyers who actually make a living keeping the other agencies from getting into their business. And it's really hard to
Right.
believe that's the case.
Yeah,
But
they actually, there's an element that actually interprets it as a reallocation or a change in the appropriation of Congress in some sense. There's actually even challenges of us partnering and sending money to an agency because it looks like we got an appropriation to ours, which we're now circumventing Congress's will.
so Monica, you get the last question as a pulmonary chief. We haven't had many pulmonary questions.
I'm just following up actually on Victor's comment, because I think we were talking a lot about industry and NIH partnerships, but I'm going to be honest with you, I just don't think it's working. I've tried to actually move forward in some of my own circles, and I think the lawyers get involved, talk about IP and data ownership, and it doesn't move. And in an area where we, you know, there have been challenges with funding and we have opportunities, not all industry partnerships are going to work, because agendas are different, but sometimes they're actually not. I would love to see a situation where it actually can work. I feel like we've been talking and talking about it, but nothing actually happens. So I just would love to be part of the solution and not just sit here and complain. So I just need to let you know at the site level, it doesn't, at least my perception is it doesn't seem
Yeah, no, it's,
to be negative.
yeah, no, we appreciate that, Micah. And again, I think some of the consternation, certainly at NIH, Francis has been, I know, doing his best, I think, to work on this. He's got this target validation initiative that seemed like it was ripe for that kind of partnership. And all I can say is that it's, you know, clearly pharma has its own challenges about thinking about these things. So stay tuned. You know, I think we're always going to be willing partners, though.
Great. So Gary, I want to thank you on behalf of the institution. You've been inspirational, and it's been like a track race for you. You arrived, you went to dinner with the community, you got quizzed by junior faculty, fellows, senior faculty, and you're still standing. So that's tremendous. And we have reception. And also, though, I should note, and you actually were at UNC the day before, which anyone who can tolerate that and then still impressive.
Yeah.
So thanks again, and we'll now adjourn for a reception.
Great.